now. I'll minimize my video so that none of you get captured in the screen recording. But that way, if there are people who can't get online, I can send that to them and they can make this up on their own. You can see that we're going to continue with the causes of the Crusades today. If you are behind on your DBQ essays, this little extra time in the afternoon might be a little gift in order to help you catch up. You can go to the email that I sent yesterday, which has the link to the DBQ guide, and you can just be working through those pieces as best you can. Make sure to follow those instructions nice and closely. In class, though, we're going to continue to move ahead and think about the beginnings of the Crusades. We're going to review the outline from yesterday a little bit, and then we're going to look at a couple of sources, most of which then that we can do on our screen. The first thing I'm going to do, though, is have us head into some breakout rooms. What you're going to do is use your outline from yesterday to find the answers to the questions below. Just like in the Kahoot, I gave you questions that should provide you with hints on where to look in the outline. Remember that the goal of note-taking is to think as we take notes, organize our ideas so that if we need to look back at them later on, we can find the information that we're looking for. And an outline is nice because it's organizing these within like the big concepts that are these Roman numerals, the major ideas, which are the capital letters, and then the more specific details within there. And if you remember, we kind of said that this outline is organized by causes, then events, and then on the back, the results. And within each of those, it's kind of organized based upon the kind of topic. And so with the causes, each letter represents one of the major groups who helped lead to the Crusades. Within the events, it's broken down within the different crusades that took place. And then the results is just kind of a list. So what I'd like you to do is think for a minute about how you would answer these. Hopefully you have handout number 10 in front of you, in which case you can be looking at your outline. Then I'll put you in a small group and you can talk about them together, hopefully again using that outline. If you were absent and you don't have the outline, just try and read through them and use some logic. And then when the other people are discussing, you might be able to get some ideas about the correct answers. So you've got 1 minute to kind of just look over, think, and use the outline.
Is there gonna be like multiple answers for questions or no?
I think there should just be one answer. About 30 more seconds to think, and then I'll put you in some rooms. Okay, talk through the answers. Make sure that you are using the outline if you have it. Okay. I didn't put answers on screen because I shared the link for this ahead of time and I didn't want people to see them. So I'm just going to talk them through really quickly. Number 5, what was not a result? And again, these not questions are tricky, but what was not a result is that feudal power increased. It actually went down. What's tricky is if you looked at the causes section, it might have said how the feudal lords thought they were going to gain more power, and that was their hope. But as the fighting went on, they did not. We're going to learn what caused them to actually lose power. And that's really important because once these feudal lords are losing power, it means that the feudal system and manor system gets weakened and can start to come to an end. And that's why the Crusades are this turning point, is because it begins to weaken these old systems and strengthen some new groups that eventually lead to the modern world. Number 6, we would say Richard. Okay. He's the one who wins enough battles that he's able to negotiate with the Muslims so that at least Christian pilgrims can go to Jerusalem. He's not able to conquer the city, but he's able to kind of create a little bit of a compromise. Number 7, we did a little bit with yesterday, but what was not a reason for the Pope is letter A. He's not trying to take control over trade. The merchants are more interested in that. He's attempting to increase church power, to unify people underneath him, and to stop the Turks, who he sees as like these Muslim enemies. He doesn't want them spreading into Europe the way they did across the Middle East. Number 8 is the First Crusade. That's the only crusade that they are, for a time, able to actually take control over Jerusalem. They rule it for about 50 years, and then in the Second Crusade, they lose it again. And so we're going to see how this is like a back and forth between the two groups. And then number 9 is Germany and France, right? One of the things we'll notice as we look at the maps is that each crusade involves people from some different parts of Europe. Even though they're coming together a little bit, they never completely unify. And so you kind of have like the Germans and the French happening in the Second Crusade, the British in the Third Crusade. And so they each are working a little on their own. All right, next up, I'm going to put you in a new set of groups and we're going to analyze this painting to think a little bit about what it shows to us regarding the Crusades. I want you to first think about if it's a primary or secondary source, and then I want you to answer these questions. Now, I have them labeled as 1s and 2s, but it can be a little more flexible than that since we're going to be in these breakout groups. Um, Go ahead. This is kind of a tricky question, so let's see what you're thinking. Type into the chat whether you believe that this is primary or secondary. A lot of us are saying primary, and there's logic to that, but you're wrong. And what's tricky is we have to think about the dates of the Crusades themselves. And so if you remember from yesterday, we're looking roughly from like 1100 to 1300. So they're this 200-year time period towards the middle of the Middle Ages. And so this is after 1400, which means it's after the Crusades, which end in about 1300. So the painter here, there's no way he was alive during the Crusades. He's creating this based upon how that event is remembered or his own research into the event. And so this is showing us more about how people are thinking about the Crusades later in the Middle Ages than maybe they were right in that original moment. And that's where you have to be really careful with, are we thinking about this as from the Middle Ages or as we thinking about it from studying the Crusades, and when does it relate to the time period? Now, what is this showing how like the Pope is remembered as gaining power or at least hoping to gain power? I would say the fact that he's in the center of the painting, like we've talked before, that he is seated, whereas everybody else is standing or even kneeling in front of him. The colors with this like dark background and kind of bland reds everywhere, with him standing out in the middle with this like dark blue and white, that's showing his power as well, right? Including this like bright gemstone right in the center. And so they're emphasizing the Pope's power in the way that they're remembering this. And then they really start to focus on where that power is coming from by using some symbolism, which will be common in these types of artworks. This crucifix and sometimes this like two horizontal bars. That's not how we often think of the cross today, but it's the medieval crosses were often designed that way. This is representing his religious power, and you can even see like it's being given to him by a person in the clothing of a cleric. So this is probably like a bishop kind of handing him this religious power that the church always had control over. But through the Crusades, he's trying to reach for some military power as well. This guy's in his little armor, and so he's supposed to represent the knights and the nobles. And one of the goals we'll see of the church is trying to lead these wars would mean that then they would be taking more direct command of the military, which had long been the one part of life that they never had the direct control over, at least not as much as with religion and economics and even politics. All right, next up, let's analyze a map. So you won't have your book in front of you, but that's okay. I think you should be able to see it pretty well on screen. I want you to start by identifying some map features. So what are some of the tools here that are meant to help you? And then in your small groups, I want you to answer these questions on the screen. They're actually a little tricky, so take your time with them. You will see similar questions on future quizzes and tests. Okay. I'll skip past the map features. By this point, hopefully you're identifying things like compass and legend, scale, and labels. Let's talk about some of the actual questions down here. So part of my goal is for you to be able to see, like, to trace which crusade we're looking at. We follow the color coding. And so you can see, when did they travel most by sea? I would have said the third crusade, right? A little bit in the fourth crusade too. So if you gave that answer, that makes sense. Whereas the earlier crusades are more overland. We're going to see that the fact that those later crusades are going over water is going to have a really big impact, because it's going to begin this water route of trade that's really important in the late Middle Ages. And it's really going to kick off trade and exploration and make a huge difference. This question was the harder one, and I promise you, you will see this one again. When you're looking at this, when it says insert, it means kind of like this bonus map within a map. So like you can see it's zooming in on this section of land down here. But what you might notice is that the color coding is different. And that's because the timing is different. So if you're looking at our main map, it's showing us 1095. So that's before the First Crusade. So before the First Crusade, purple represents most of Europe, because that's where Christianity was most popular. And in these green lands, as we've learned in our DBQ, these are the areas that Islam had spread to by 1095, right? This map now is looking at 1130. And so the answer should have been the First Crusade, because we're here after the First Crusade in 1099 ends, but before 1147. And so after that First Crusade, we might notice now that this green area has turned to purple in our zoomed in map. And that's showing us that in between those two time periods during the First Crusade, the Europeans were able to conquer some of this Holy Land from the Muslims, and they divided it into these little kingdoms that crusaders led, some of the powerful lords from the time period. What we'll see later on is that the Muslims capture this land back. And so that's where, if you're really analyzing maps, you have to pay attention to these small details, right? Not just the purple and green, but when do they represent? When are some of these other time periods? And looking at things like these titles to get a sense of what each piece is showing us. Okay, believe it or not, it's 10:25. So that's the end of our social studies Zoom for today. Tomorrow we'll get back into the handout number 11, or yep, and work on the textbook piece and kind of bring some of these documents to life. Have a good rest of your day. Your next class starts at 10:30.